Skal vi ha debatt som en del av Skepsisuka, arrangert av laget her på NTNU. Det er veldig kult å kalle det debatt. Da oppfordrer de til liksom krig, og det blir veldig bra. Men det kommer til å minne mer om samtale. Fordi målet her er heller å ha en god samtale og komme fram til noe enn å knive hverandre ned. Så er det sånn at på punktene nede så har dere mulighet til å gi tilbakemelding på arrangementet. Det ønsker vi veldig gjerne. Det er kun hvis dere gir god tilbakemelding at vi kan gjøre det bedre igjen neste år. Og det er også mulighet til å melde seg på å kunne snakke med en kristen. Om det er for å få ut frustrasjon, eller om det er for å ha en god, dyp samtale, det er litt sånn opp til det. Du har i hvert fall muligheten til å melde deg på en sånn, ta en kaffe. Du blir sannsynligvis oppringt i morgen eller noe, hvor vi prøver å avtale samtale senere. Det var det for meg det. So I'm turning over to English. The format of the debate this evening is we're going to have an opening statement with about 2,000 words. The reason why we're mentioning words is because they have already prepared a written format and have exchanged them to each other, so they have read each other's opening statement, so the debate will be a better debate. Then we will have a first rebuttal, 10 minutes per person. Then a second rebuttal of 5 minutes each. And then we will have a cross-examination with 2 questions from each person. And we will have a closing statement with 5 minutes each before we open for questions and answers from the audience. And we ask you to reserve your questions until the end so that we will keep a good flow in the debate. The participants today in the debate called Does God Exist? Is Einar Duenger Bøhn. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Agder. His areas of specialization are metaphysics, artificial intelligence, ethics, and philosophy of religion. He has published a number of articles, mainly within philosophy of religion and metaphysics. And he's also the author of the forthcoming book, God and Abstract Objects, given out by Cambridge University Press, and along with a Norwegian book called Mening om livet, given out on the Spartacus forlag. The Christian representative here is Peter S. Williams. He's an assistant professor in communication and worldviews at Gimlekollen School of Journalism and Communication and Einar University in Norway. His publications include, or his books include Understanding Jesus and A Faithful Guide to Philosophy, given out on Paternoster forlag. So I will give the room for Peter to give his first opening statement, and then we'll just go on when he's finished.
Much. See if I can correctly adjust this headvice torture device that they give you to wear here. There we go. So thank you. Thank you to the organisers, Christian Union here at the university, to Professor Einar, of course, to Leif, who's stepped in at the last minute because the chap who was going to moderate today has fallen ill, so Leif is stepping into the breach for us. And thank you most of all, of course, for you for coming out on an afternoon to spend some time thinking about these deep issues. Most people would agree with the Roman writer Cicero, who asked, what could be more clear or obvious when we look up to the sky and contemplate the heavens than that there is some divinity of superior intelligence? Such intuitive perceptions of divinity are properly basic beliefs grounded in experience, which mean that they're reasonable to accept in the absence of sufficient counter-evidence. Nonetheless, I will sketch a selection of arguments for belief in a supernatural creator. Consider first the experience of the writer Teresa Vining, who as a student began to doubt God's existence. She says, for some time there'd been a gnawing uncertainty deep within me. What if it is all a lie? When Teresa hit rock bottom, she discovered some intuitions which countered her skepticism. There is no God, I told myself. This life is all that there is. There is no real meaning, no basis for knowing what's right and what's wrong. It doesn't matter what we do or how we live. No, something deep inside me screamed. It could not be true. I couldn't believe that life was just a sick joke, with humans and their capacity for love, appreciation of beauty, the need for meaning as the pitiful punchline. That went against all of my experience as a human being. There had to be something more. That night was the beginning of a new search for truth in my life, because the one thing I did know after that night was I couldn't believe that this life is all that there is. If the satisfaction of innate existential desires, such as those mentioned by Vining, requires God to exist to satisfy them, then the intuition that life isn't absurd suggests that God exists. Indeed, experience indicates that natural, innate desires are, in fact, good indicators that objects really exist to satisfy those desires. At the very least, we should assume that no type of innate desire exists in vain until and unless we're shown otherwise. Now, some people may profess a willingness to pay the price of affirming that life is absurd, but this affirmation isn't easy to make or to consistently sustain. As Andy Bannister asks, what was it that possessed evolution to equip us, and us alone among the animal kingdom, with desires not just for cake and copulation, but for value, meaning, purpose, and significance? If atheism is true, we are at best biological freaks whose desires no more map onto reality than do those of a dyslexic cartographer. If atheism is true, not merely is there no meaning to which those desires connect, but the very fact that we have them at all would make us fundamentally irrational, deluded creatures. But if we are that irrational, that demented, then we can't trust any of our instincts, not one of our desires, none of our most cherished beliefs, including our belief in cake and hope and meaning, or even atheism. The atheist Sam Harris affirms that our logical, mathematical, and physical intuitions have not been designed by natural selection to track truth with a capital T. Atheist philosopher of mind Patricia Churchland agrees that the principal chore of the nervous system is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Truth definitely takes the hindmost, she says. But if truth takes the hindmost on naturalism, how can naturalists be confident about the truth of naturalism or atheism? Indeed, while even the ability to think thoughts that are true or false about reality, that resists naturalistic explanation, that human rationality fits within a theistic worldview. Now, Cicero also observed, seeing letters arranged into a poem, we would naturally infer design. Such a pattern is both specified and sufficiently improbable to merit a design inference, on the grounds that in all cases where we know the causal origin of specified complexity, experience has shown that intelligent design played a causal role. The natural world exhibits many examples of specified complexity. For example, Stephen Hawking notes that for life to exist, the initial state of the universe had to be set up in a very special and highly improbable way. The best explanation for this so-called cosmic fine-tuning is design. Talking of the initial state of the universe, Big Bang cosmology describes the expansion of the universe over a finite length of time. But it doesn't explain why the universe exists. A physical event is a contingent reality, and a contingent reality is, by definition, contingent upon something beyond itself. Hence, every physical event must have at least one cause, in at least a general sense of that term. Well, since the first physical event cannot depend upon a physical reality, the fact that our universe had a beginning highlights the need for a non-physical and non-contingent cause. Non-theists must either deny that a contingent thing is dependent upon something outside of itself, or else claim that every physical event has a physical cause. However, both denials are ad hoc, and invoking the necessity of physical causation entails an unparsimonious and arguably impossible infinite regress, and a regress that all of the available scientific evidence excludes. The atheist Peter Cave defends the reality of objective moral duties by appealing to his intuitions about evil, explaining that whatever sceptical arguments may be brought against our belief that killing the innocent is morally wrong, we are more certain that the killing is morally wrong than that the sceptical argument is sound. By the principle of credulity, say killing an innocent child just for fun, killing isn't merely something that stops the child from functioning normally, which is an empirical observation, or merely something that we dislike because of our evolutionary history, or merely something that our society has decided to discourage. Rather, such an act is objectively wrong, something that we discover we are required and obligated not to do. Of course, at least some of our moral intuitions could be wrong, but this very admission of moral fallibility presupposes moral objectivism. For if subjectivism were true, no moral claims could be objectively false. As the atheist Schaeffer-Landau argues, subjectivism's picture of ethics entails a kind of moral infallibility for individuals or societies. But this sort of infallibility is hard to swallow. Moreover, if moral subjectivism were true, it couldn't be the case that we objectively ought to consider arguments for subjectivism, or that we ought to consider them fairly. Knowing this, we see that to accept any argument for subjectivism would be to take the self-contradictory position that A, there are no objective moral duties, but B, we objectively ought to accept subjectivism. Objective moral duties then are transcendent prescriptions that obligate our behaviour. But a prescription requires a prescriber, and an obligation requires someone to whom we are obligated. Stephen B. Cowan comments, "It might be asked why objective moral values cannot simply exist as brute facts. The problem with this suggestion is that it cannot explain why moral values should have anything whatsoever to do with us. Moral values prescribe behaviour. Moral values, understood objectively, bind our consciences. But why should moral values, if they're just simple brute facts, bind my conscience? Moral prescriptions make sense only if there is a moral prescriber." Or as H.P. Owen argued, "The dictates of society cannot explain the absoluteness of the categorical moral imperative. But insofar as they are personal, they have a superficial credibility. Their belief in an impersonal order of claims does not provide the personal basis which their imperatival quality requires. On the one hand, objective moral claims transcend every human person. On the other hand, it's contradictory to assert that impersonal claims are entitled to the allegiance of our wills. The only solution to this paradox is to suppose that the order of objective moral claims is in fact rooted in the personality of God." Finally, theism, I think, offers the best explanation of various historical facts about Jesus. A first-century Jew who not only laid claim to divinity without appearing to be either a madman or a confidence trickster, but who pointed to his fulfillment of prophecy, including his miracles and his resurrection from the dead, as signs that he was indeed who he claimed to be. Jewish scriptures, written hundreds of years before the first century, contained many predictions about the origins, actions, and fate of the Messiah, including predictions that it would have been impossible to fulfill by human manipulation, but which accurately describe Jesus. A conservative estimate of the odds of anyone fulfilling, say, just 12 of these prophecies would be 1 in 10 to the 12. That's odds of 1 trillion to 1. As Thomas B. Morris observes, a series of prophecies made by different people at different times, culminating in a single fulfillment by the life of so remarkable a person as Jesus, cries out for an explanation. The most reasonable explanation is that God was involved in the prophecy and the fulfillment. And historical evidence shows that Jesus died on a Roman cross, was buried in a tomb, which was later found empty, and that individuals and groups of people subsequently had unexpected experiences in which they sincerely believed they interacted with a resurrected Jesus. It's important to note that Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising, Messiah. And Jewish beliefs about the afterlife prohibited anyone's rising from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. The controversial question is how best to explain this generally accepted historical data. I would argue with N.T. Wright that as long as one doesn't rule out miracles a priori, all the other explanations for why Christianity arose and took the shape that it did are far less convincing as historical explanations than the one that the early Christians themselves offer, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. So these arguments from desire, rationality, design, causation, duty, and Jesus But just a sampling from dozens of arguments, I think, jointly validate the widespread perception that there exists a supernatural creator. Thank you.
Way with your sound system.
First I do dust. Right. Where is it? Is that right? Can you hear me? So thank you for being invited, and thank Peter for this open, interesting statement. And I will give mine. So, question is, does God exist? Now, a presupposition of this question, at least as I am handling it, is that there's a kind of monotheism there. There's one and only one God. And one way does this thing exist. Also, I think we should know that before we try to answer any such question, I want to know what it means. So when I want to answer a question, I first want to know what the question means. And in this question, there are two components, namely God and exist. That is the most important. I assume we know the question mark and does, and then we'll consider God and exist. And by God, I will mean something minimal. Namely, something like an intentional being worthy of worship. That's my phrase. That God is such an intentional being means that God has intends certain things over others. That God is worthy of worship means that God has sufficiently many great-making properties, namely also properties. Anything that's great, basically. And not too many bad-making properties. And it needs to have sufficiently many to be correctly worshipped. So it's worthy of being worshipped. Among them must be a certain degree of goodness, knowledge, and power, perhaps, so that God can realize certain of his intentions. If he's supposed to be the creator of the universe, for example, he must have sufficient amount of knowledge and power to be able to realize his intentions. If he just had the intentions, like me when I'm cleaning the house, I have a lot of intentions, but I don't have the willpower to do it. If God was like that, it wouldn't be any universe. So he needs to have the power, the knowledge, and the willingness, and so on. So there's a lot built into this. So he needs to be able to realize his own intentions. Or I don't know what the gender of God is. Note that the more we put into the meaning of God, the less likely it is that this thing exists, or the less we know about this thing. This is just a matter of probability and logic, basically, and knowledge, because the more we bake into a concept, the more is required of the world to realize that concept. So if I just say the world exists, very little is required. But if I say the world exists as a pink sphere, then more is required of the world to realize that claim. So we need to be more, the more we bake into it, the less likely it is to actually happen. So I want to bake as little as possible into the concept of God in order to talk about it and feel like I know what I'm talking about when I ask this question. So I don't want to, for example, say that, at least not at the get-go when we start out, I don't want to say that he's the Father of Jesus and there's a Trinity, and I don't want to bake all these complicated things into it when we get going, because that will make it very much hard to get started. And then we get to them later, when we've started out whether this minimal thing exists. Okay, so that's what I mean by God. The intentional being that has that's worthy of worship, has to evaluate properties. Now, what do we mean by exist? Maybe should I give another example of the minimum, how much is required? Like, think of a dice, like 2 dice or a die. What's required for you to throw a 3 on one die? Well, 1 out of 6 options. The world needs to realize 1 out of 6 options. But if you want to throw a 12, say, or you want to throw a 7 with 2 dice, then 1 out of 6 with respect to 2 different dice needs to be realized. And there are various ways it can be realized. It could be a 3 and a 4, it could be a 5 and a 2. So more is required to throw those 2 die to get a 7 than to throw 1 die to get a 6. There's less likely. That sort of considerations. So that's why I think we should start with less when we start talking about God. Not presuppose at the get-go that it's this kind of God or that kind of God. So the point is very simple. I'm just saying very little about what I mean by God. So maybe Peter and I will disagree with this later. Okay, so what should we mean by exist? That's tricky as well. I think for general philosophical purposes, we should not treat to exist as equivalent with being actual, for example. Because there might be merely possible things. Philosophers are concerned with this, like there being possible worlds, stuff that could happen, but hasn't really been actually the case. Like I could have had a twin brother. And there are other cases, like there could have been more numbers than there are, maybe, or something like that. And that philosophers think that these possibilia, these merely possible things, they exist in some other sense than the actual. Some philosophers think that's true. So I don't want to presuppose that to exist is just to be actual like us. There could be merely possible things as well. I also don't want to presuppose that to exist is to be physical, because there could be non-physical stuff as well. So you don't want to say that God exists means God is physical, because it could be non-physical stuff, like mental stuff, or abstract stuff, or merely possible stuff that's not physical. So I don't want to treat existence as equivalent with physical, I don't want to treat it as equivalent with actual. I also don't want to treat it as equivalent with concrete. That's sometimes used as different from physical. Some concrete stuff is not physical, but it's supposed to abstract stuff. Like mathematics, numbers are abstract. Concrete stuff is like particles and quarks are concrete. Some quarks are concrete, but maybe not physical. These are technical differences, but let's not assume that exist means being in any one of these categories that are already controversial as to whether there are anything in them. So if I want to know, does God exist, I shouldn't assume that he's in one ontological category, as we call it, from another. Just say, does he exist or not? Existence should be something that covers them all. So to exist is really hard to figure out what that means, because it couldn't be being in one of these categories. So I really don't know what existence means. So when I ask, does God exist, I find that very hard, because I can't, when I ask, does life exist, I can think of that as like, yeah, well, it does, it's there, a physical being sitting right there. But I can't assume that the existence of it is the physicalness of it. So I just want to know whether something exists, and I can't point to any category. That's very hard for me to say what that means. One thing that is good illumination of existence, philosophy we talk this way, it's not a definition, but it's a good way of thinking of existence. It's to say that something exists, and this is independent of whatever category of existence it's in. But something exists, that means that there is something identical to it. It's a way of illuminating existence. So when I say numbers exist, so when I say number 2 exists, I say there's something identical to the number 2. And that seems true. When I say life exists, life maybe exists, there's something identical to it. That's what it means. When I say that my possible twin brother exists in some sense, there is something that's identical to him. But he's not visible, he's not actual, or any of those categories. It's really possible. So that's a good way of illuminating existence. But the tricky part is that when you do that with God, you're making God into this particular thing, like me and you. You're saying there's something identical to God. That's what it is for God to exist. Well, we wonder, what is this thing that's supposed to be identical to God? To make sense of the question. It's not a physical being. It's not presumably some kind of concrete being, but it's outside of space-time maybe. It's really hard to get a grasp of what it is that's identical to this thing. And also, God is supposed to be infinite, right? From many approaches. It's supposed to be infinite in all respects. So, there's a big question, could there be a thing that's infinite in all respects? Infinite in extension, infinite in time, or maybe a-extensional. It doesn't fit that category of having an extension in space. It doesn't fit the category of time, so it's atemporal. It's really hard to say what it is for something to be something to be identical to that. So it's really I'm really losing grip on what God is supposed to be, and also what it's supposed to mean to say that this thing that I don't really know what it is exists, because it doesn't exist seemingly in the senses that I can make of existence elsewhere. So I think it's hard to say something about both of these terms, actually. So you ask the question. This is a classical philosophical approach. You get asked to debate, and you start questioning the question, and then you never make any progress. But there's progress to realizing where there's no progress, right? So my best understanding of existence is perhaps something like a theologian that I like called Paul Tillich. His understanding is that God is being itself. So I know that there is being. Being, I just mean things that are, exist. There is being, and God is supposed to be that being itself, according to Paul Tillich. So he's not a particular thing of some category. He's just the underlying being of everything. That's what God is supposed to be. So maybe that makes sense, but then it's hard. So according to Tillich, to be identical with something is to be finite, right? Just like I said, to be something is to be a finite, limited thing. But God isn't supposed to be like that. It's just being itself, which is like infinite, transcends all categories of being. So it's no particular thing, but He's being, which is not like a thing. Can you make sense of this? This amounts to some kind of mysticism, I think. We can't really say much more. And Tillich himself says that, well, this is where it all stops. We can't really expect to be able to say more. So I think that's, and maybe all explanations have to stop somewhere, right? It can't go on forever. Maybe it has to stop in mysticism at some point. So maybe that's a way of understanding the question. I can play along with that for a bit. Now, so I'm going to work with this notion, right? So I say that God is that kind of thing. It's like the underlying being of everything. And that's not a particular thing. It's not a limited, finite thing. It's an infinite, transcendent category of being, which is underlying you and me and abstract objects and concrete stuff. So let's just work with that to get going. We can't get stuck forever here. I got limited time. So are there any reasons to think such a God exists? So Peter gave a bunch of reasons. I think the best reason, which is to me still defeasible, it's a reason that might be outweighed by other reasons, in other words. But I think the best reason is what Peter was mentioning in the case of cosmic fine-tuning. So cosmology, physics and cosmology, the study of the universe, they've actually claimed that the constants and laws of nature have a certain value. They're just like a quantity that they're measured. Like gravity has so much strength, and the electron has a negative charge, and to a certain extent, and it has certain mass. That's just a quantity that they measure. And it's not like they've reasoned themselves to these quantities. They've just observed, measured. So they set up for a measurement system, and then they find these quantities. And they find the different kinds of quantities, and they look really arbitrary. They look like 3.5, 6.8, and there's no reason to think, why isn't it just 7? Why couldn't it just be 1 and 0? It's like it doesn't look natural, it's just arbitrary numbers, these quantities, the fundamental constants of the universe. And what they've also figured out is that if you modified any one of these constant quantities, the laws of the constants, if you made gravity a bit stronger or weaker, or if you made the mass of the electron stronger or weaker, more or less, it just wouldn't be possible for it to be the kind of life that we have. So biological life as we know it is only possible when the quantities are roughly as they are and in the correlation to each other as they are. So the ratio between them has to be exactly right. And they could take on infinitely many other values, at least a lot of other values. And any other combination wouldn't have life like us. So that's really mysterious. And something that sort of cries out for explanation. In fact, it's so unlikely that the probability along one of the axes for life is actually this. It's 1 to the chances of life is like 1 to 10 to the power of 55, meaning 55 zeros after. It's like unimaginably big along one out of their axis of measurements. And it's so unlikely that no one would put any money on that one thing happening. If you had a dartboard and all the dots, you had 10 to the power of 55 dots, and you threw it, and you're going to hit one, and if you only hit that one, you would get the jackpot. Everything else would be impossible for you to live. You wouldn't go for it. It's so unlikely to set your life on that one. Right? So in the case of the constants, it's so unlikely that there's life. And yeah, here we are, living, presumably. So it's so unlikely, because it needs an explanation. And that, many people think, the best reason for why there still is life, despite this probability of it not being life, is that there's some intention behind it. If someone with the power and knowledge and willingness and all that, someone had all that, and he rigged the game, he just tuned all the knobs exactly right, and just hit play, and there was life. Right? Then it's explainable why there's life, why this one among all these happened, because someone wanted it to happen. Then you have an explanation. But if you just said, oh, it's just shit happens, it's pure chance, then you wouldn't think this would ever happen. It's so unlikely. So it's a bad explanation. So either you have to just say there's no explanation for it, it's just chance and we are here, or you would have to say there's some kind of intention behind it. And I think actually, when you compare this argument to other kinds of argumentation that you find in science in general and in ordinary life in general, it's exactly the same strategy we use to argue ourselves into reasonable positions that we would use to invoke God here. So I think if you say, oh no, the chance hypothesis is much more likely, you're being somewhat inconsistent there. Because you use the same kind of argumentation everywhere else, so why not here? It's like you have accepted this kind of argumentation in every area of life, and when it comes to God, you're just like, oh, I'm not going to accept it this time. It seems really arbitrary. So I agree with Peter that this is a pretty good argument to give some reason for the existence of some kind of intention behind the universe, actually. And it's much better than these design arguments that goes down to the detailed biological levels, because there are better explanations there. But when it comes to the universe, it's different. You can't invoke garbage at the universe level. There are some competing hypotheses like multiverses, but I'm not talking about that. So I think this is one good reason to believe in this God. I'm not saying there are no reasons. I think the best reason against God is the problem of evil. I think you're all familiar with that. A lot of bad things happen, and if there's a God with intention, willingness, and power to deal with this universe, you should have dealt with some of that evil already. You should probably have shown himself a bit more often, not just like maybe once a long time ago. So I think the problem of evil is the better reason against. So at this point, I really don't know. I might disappoint you. You might thought I was going to come here and be the atheist and like fight Peter over this, but I really don't know what I'm supposed to think at this point. I think there are some good reasons for there being some intention behind the universe, like this argument. I think there are some really good reasons against, like the problem of evil. I think I'll talk about this later, but I think some of Peter's arguments are good and some of them are not so good, so we'll talk about that later. And I think there are pros and cons here, and I'm not sure what to believe. So I want to end by saying two things. One is that we have to, and I'm in agreement with Peter here, that we have to weigh up all considerations. This is sort of like a holistic picture. We have to weigh them up and see, here are all the pros and here are all the cons, and then where are we going to go? I think that's the best. You can't just appeal to one piece of evidence and say, oh, I had a revelation in church, that's it. I now strongly believe. It's not enough for me, because there are so many other explanations of that revelation of yours, from the outside at least, that are competing with your introspective claim. So I wouldn't be convinced by that. Either my head just turned off or some fan just turned off. Some weird change of mood. One guy is trying to tell me something. He's like, listen now. Okay, so let me add my another note. The last note is, and I've written a bit on this actually. So I think it's important to separate belief from other categories, other attitudes you can have as a religious person, like hope, for example. So if you're a theist, you believe, traditional understanding of theism is that you believe that there's a God. If you're an atheist, you believe that there's no God. And if you're an agnostic, you don't believe that there's a God. You also don't believe that there's no God. You just withhold all your beliefs. And you say, I don't know. Now, I think there are other categories that are interesting here. I don't feel at home in any of these categories. So there are other categories, like, I actually hope that there's a God. I think it would be awesome if I realized that there was this fundamental being itself that was worthy of worship. And I would be like, that is awesome. This is like Star Trek times 10. That would be really cool. And I really hope that there's such a thing. It would be good. It would be showing that there's actually goodness at bottom, maybe even. We just screwed up for a while. So I actually hope that there's a God, but I don't really believe that there's a God. I don't have enough evidence. I'm like Bertrand Russell. If I came to the gates of heaven and they asked me, why didn't you ever start believing? I was like, I didn't have enough evidence. You didn't give me enough. But I still think you would accept me because I'm such a nice guy. But I would close with the thought that I think you can hope that there's a God. And I do, actually. And the interesting thing here is sort of a logical feature. You can hope something even though you don't believe it. So when I believe something, I can believe it to certain different degrees. But as long as I don't know, or as long as I'm not certain, as long as there's room for doubt, I can hope contrary to my belief. So I can say, I believe that my wife is cheating on me. But I really hope that she's not. That makes sense. So this goes for all the categories, right? I didn't even mention my wife and said here. But that goes for every category. You can believe that there's a God and hope that there's not. And you can believe that there's no God and hope that there is. This is a logically coherent position. It makes semantically sense as well. Now note that hope is different from wishing, for example. So if you say, I know that the earth is round, but I wish it was flat. That makes sense. But that's contrafactual. It's wishing something were the case, that's actually the case. But in hoping, you're actually hoping that something is the case that isn't, you believe isn't. So it keeps you here, close at home. So hope is an interesting category. And I think for many purposes that's enough for me. I can hope that there's a God, and I can live accordingly. I don't know. I can live accordingly and hope that there's a God, even though I don't believe. So I'll say more about this later, but I'm just not seeing the fixation on belief. And I think in times when there's extremism and discrimination and hatred based on religion, maybe the strong categories of belief is overrated. Maybe we should hope, because you're less willing to act on your hope than your beliefs. If you believe stuff, if you believe it's true, you're willing to bet on it, you're willing to act on it. But if you just hope, I wouldn't be willing to act so much on it. If I just hope that there's, $1 million outside, I wouldn't be able to set my life on the fact that being $1 million outside is. But if I believe it, I'm happy. Okay, so that was my next step. I think, hold on. One sentence. Oh, sorry, I'm taking maybe too long. The question remains, of course, does God exist or not? I haven't answered it. I haven't said yes or no. The answer is that I just don't know. That was my
So I'd like to thank Einar for his very substantial, I thought interesting opening speech. It's unfortunate that I don't have time in my 10 minutes here to address every aspect of that speech here and now. Einar thinks that the arguments for and against theism of God are equally balanced. He illustrates this from the evidential argument from evil on the one hand and the fine-tuning argument from design on the other. However, on the one hand, note that the evidential argument from evil isn't an argument for atheism, but rather an argument against a specific concept of deity. Moreover, as the atheist Michael Tooley notes, even if it can be shown that the evils that are found in the world render the existence of God unlikely, it might still be the case that the existence of God is not unlikely, all things considered. For perhaps the argument from evil can be overcome by appealing either to positive arguments in support of the existence of God, or to the idea that belief in the existence of God is properly basic. Daniel Howard Snyder gives the following illustration of this last point. Suppose you learn that 95% of the French population cannot swim. This statistic is good evidence to think that Pierre, your friend from Paris, can't swim. Does it follow that you should believe that Pierre can't swim? Well, what if you and Pierre spent last Saturday afternoon together swimming? Your experience with Pierre is much better evidence to think that he can swim, even though the statistical evidence by itself makes it very likely that he cannot swim. Now, most people who experience the bad things that happen in the world, nevertheless, also experience the world as intended by a being worthy of worship. On the other hand, Einar acknowledges that God is a better explanation of fine-tuning than that it happened by pure chance, he says. The only alternative scientific explanation is physical necessity, but these constants he was talking about are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants. And the fine-tuning also includes certain arbitrary initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the universe. The inability of physical necessity to account for fine-tuning explains why the most popular objection to this argument seeks to reduce the complexity of fine-tuning by positing multiple universes. But that's like explaining a book by positing enough monkeys typing away for long enough to have produced it by chance. In the absence of independent evidence for enough monkeys and so on, the one author explanation is preferable, and the same goes for fine-tuning. And this is the situation in which we find ourselves. For according to physicist Brian Greene, people should be sceptical of multiverse theories because there is no evidence supporting their existence. Indeed, there's evidence against a multiverse. Roger Penrose asked us to consider how ridiculously cheaper, in sense of improbabilities, it would be to simply produce by the random collision of particles the entire solar system with all of its life ready-made. Why do we not come about this way, rather than from an absurdly less probable Big Bang? It seems to me, he says, that this conundrum simply points to the incorrectness of the bubble, the multi-universe idea. Bertrand Russell declared that man is the product of causes that had no provision of the ends they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves, his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. Well, the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Well, as the supposed outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, Russell's atheism can't explain or justify his belief in atheism. Nor does his scaffolding of unyielding despair square with his desire for something beyond the universe. Russell admitted that the centre of me is always and eternally a terrible pain, a curious, wild pain, a searching for something beyond what the world contains. He wrote, "Something in one seems obstinately to belong to God and to refuse to enter into any earthly communion. Or at least that's how I should express it if I thought there was a God. I care passionately for this world, and yet, what is it all for? There must be something more important, one feels, although I don't believe that there is. The psychologist Viktor Frankl called this innate desire that life should have an adequate meaning and purpose and significance our primary need. Theologian Clark Pinnock comments that when the word God is used, one thing it has reference to is the objective ground in reality itself of our ineradicable confidence in the final worth of our existence. I would suggest that we reflect on our attitudes, our actions. Do they not imply this very confidence, even if we've not actually taken the step of explicit faith in God? There is a sense in which the decision to believe renders explicit the seeds of faith, implicit in the confidence that humanists and Christians both manifest towards the goodness, the worthwhileness of life. Hence, if one is agnostic about God's existence, reaching out to God is nonetheless a reasonable thing to do. Such faith may involve a fairly minimal concept of God. But further contemplation and experience may build upon this. And indeed, the existential desire for a transcendent foundation of hope is itself a clue pointing to God's existence. For one can argue, 1, humans have an innate desire for the transcendent. 2, most innate human desires relate to some object of satisfaction. 3, therefore, the transcendent probably exists. I agree with Einar that we must weigh all such considerations for and against God's existence up against each other. I agree that if one is agnostic about God's existence, it can be rational to place one's active hope or trust in God. Perhaps I'm going just slightly further, actually, than Einar said in his speech there with that comment. You can do that, and such faith is wholly compatible with respect for reason and evidence. As Einar says, it's not always irrational to act on one's hope. So I can live religiously without believing one thing or another with respect to God's existence. However, I do think that such hope is in itself one of those clues that together, I think, contribute to a sufficient case for theism. Thank you.
Thank you again. So, I will now comment on his opening speech. Now, thank you, Peter, for your comments and your opening speech. And I think actually we're in a lot of agreement on many things, actually. Which might be boring for the audience, but it might be a good sign for something being more or less reasonable. Because I think we're in agreement on, for example, that we need to overall weigh things up. I think a lot of people in philosophy, religion, are in agreement on this, more generally. We need to weigh things up. Now, my problem with, and I also with Peter on the fine-tuning argument, I think that actually gives some reason to think that there's got to be some intention behind the universe, which is most likely something like what we mean by a God. Now, of course, I don't see any reason to think that's the Christian God or something like that. All you need for the fine-tuning argument is just some kind of intention with this sufficient power and knowledge to actually pull it off. But it doesn't have to be perfectly good, for example. It could be a malicious devil who just created the universe to sit there and watch and see us like torture each other through war and bad political elections. And that could be it, right? So it doesn't follow that it has to be good. And that's where the problem of evil sort of comes in and gives some reason to think it's not perfectly good, or not perfectly powerful, not perfectly knowledgeable, because then you would have done something about it. So I think we're in a lot of agreement about these things. What I have problems with in Peter's opening speech is more the fact that he just gives 6 arguments for, and then he doesn't mention any arguments against. So I would like to see him talk about what are the biggest problems you have with the existence of God. Why so eager in showing that God exists? And what are the main problems for doubt here? And how is that way up against his 6 reasons? That's what I would want to know more about from his speech. And as I said, the problem evil is for me the biggest problem. And the cosmic tuning argument, fine tuning argument, is the biggest argument, gives the most reasons for it, I think. And then there are a bunch of other things that might come in and kick in on the weights here. But at least that's my pro and cons. I wonder what Peter's cons are. What are the main problems about this? And let me say a bit more on details. So one thing he's very eager about in his opening speech, as well as in his comments to me right now, is this idea that if we have some kind of innate desire, we should assume that it's not there for nothing. We should assume that there's an innate desire there that corresponds to something. So if I have an innate desire, or we have an innate desire for existential meaning, we want to know this can't be it. We're like Camus, we're like, this is absurd, this is pointless, it's got to be more. If I have this innate desire, I see no reason whatsoever to think that therefore we should assume that there's something corresponding to it. Because we have a lot of innate desires, or we might have a lot of innate desires that doesn't correspond to anything anymore. It might have corresponded to something when we were selected for in Darwinian evolution way back, and those conditions aren't around anymore. But I still have innate desires. We might be like aggressive for the wrong reasons today. It doesn't mean that that corresponds to any real need today. We might be afraid of the dark today. It doesn't mean that we should be afraid of the dark. We should rather be afraid of traffic. That's where we die, in the kitchen. That's where most people die. But we don't have those innate fears. We have innate fears that were built in very long time ago under different conditions. The social changes happen much faster than the biological changes. So I don't see why we should think that these desires that we have, even though they're innate, should correspond to anything real. That's our problem, that they don't usually correspond to anything real. That's why we have all these weird people out there. That's why we all have these crazy people out there. So I don't understand that argument from desire. And also there are tons of evidence from psychology that people put intentions into stuff that has no intention too easily. And this is explained because it was a survival value to give intention to some noise in the bush, to put it for example. If you heard some noise in the bush, in the dark, you're better off expecting it to be a tiger that's going to kill you. If you thought, oh, I might just, shit happens, who knows, and that tiger would eat you, so you wouldn't survive as much. If you had that fear for that noise, you would be better off and get more children and have more offspring. So there are other explanations for many of our desires. So when I put intention behind this to explain stuff, I might be doing that fallacy. I might be using an intention, an inclination I've been selected for other reasons to explain this God. So I don't see the desire argument at all. I think that's probably the argument I like the least of his opening speech. Also, there's you should cut me off as a consistent time. So there's also a couple of others, like this moral argument. That, so Peter seems to be thinking that there's either you have moral subjectivism, which means that moral values are just preferences that we have. What's good for me need not be good for you. So we can't really correct each other. There can't really be a disagreement. And there's no reason to do much at all beyond whatever my preferences are. So he seems to be saying that either you have that view, or you have like a divine foundation of morality, and there's nothing in between. But I think there are tons of positions in between. Here are a couple that are mainly discussed in philosophy. One is like formal hedonism, for example. I don't like it, but it's a theory that needs to be considered. So formal hedonism says that the only thing that has value is pain and pleasure, ultimately. There's good and bad, pain and pleasure. And everything is explained in terms of those. So when I say I ought to do something, it's because it would enhance the pleasure. And when I say you ought not to do something, it's because it would enhance pain. to do it, so you should do it. Now you explain this because of pain and pleasure being good and bad, or other way around, bad and good. So pleasure is just good. It's a good thing to have. So why do I drink? Well, it gives me pleasure. Why does it give you pleasure? Well, it just does. Why is there drinking good? Well, it gives me pleasure. Why is pleasure good? It just is. Not much more to say. So it's nothing mysterious about saying pleasure is good. That's what we like. We all like it. No one will say, I need pleasure. And when there's pain, it's like, this is bad. I don't want to be in this position of pain. I want to get out of it. So you ought not to do what gives people pain. This is a reasonable decision. It's not just subjectivism. If I just felt that your pain was good, I would just be wrong. Your pain is bad. And I would be a maniac. So this is a position that's falling in between. It's an objective theory of moral values. But it's nothing to do with God. Explanation stops at pain and pleasure rather than in God. Another one is preferences that I like more. People have preferences. Animals have preferences. It's not up to me. I can't just break off people's preferences. So my kids, they have hopes and dreams. I can't just kill them when I want to. Because that would be bad. I would be cutting off their preferences. And their hopes and dreams. That's where it all stops. That's just not something it's up to me to do. So I can't do it. I ought not to do it. There are many such theories. So I think there are middle positions here between the radical relativism, subjectivism, and the divine foundational moral theory. So that's another problem I have. Last one is just, there's also actually an objection, maybe it's an objection to subjectivism, that I think is false. He says that subjectivism. He says that subjectivist would be taken to the self-contradictory position that there are no objective moral duties. That's true, there is no that. But also that we objectively ought to accept subjectivism. Right? So they say subjectivism is true, so you ought to accept it. But if there are no moral values, the ought is misplaced there. You ought not to do anything you don't want to, right? If all the values are preferences. But there are two problems with this argument.